Sure. So the demographic story is pretty straightforward. When the world started to globalize, we started to industrialize and urbanize. And so as we moved from the farm and into the city, we changed our attitude towards children. And on the farm, kids are free labor. You have as many as you can put up with, plus one, because that's how you find out it's too many. But when you're in the city, they're an expense. So we went from having 7 kids to less than 2, pretty much everywhere. And this process in many countries began in the 40s. In the case of the Germans, it started before that. In the case of, say, the advanced developing world, Mexico, Brazil, and such, it started in the 90s. But we've all been on this same path. And the countries that started the process later have urbanized faster, and so seen their birth rates drop faster, with China being at the top of that list. The 2020s were always going to be the decade where most of the world's major economies flipped not from having too many children to too many adults, but from too many adults to too many retirees. So in an environment where you have a lot of young people, your consumption-led economic growth, a lot of labor, you can get a lot of more organic growth that way. When you have a lot of people in their 40s and 50s, they're wealthier, they're more productive, but they don't have kids anymore. So you get a little high octane growth because it can be more technologically based. But once they get into their 60s, it's over. And so we're going to see it basically ending in places like Germany and Italy and Belgium and Japan and Korea and China this decade. And we don't have an economic model for what comes next. Well, let's start with the data there. India overtook China probably almost a decade ago. The Chinese have started to revise their data. They're admitting that they overcounted by over 100 million people. So India has been the world's largest country in terms of population for some time. However, that transition as you urbanize and have fewer children, that has hit India as well. And since India was kind of a latecomer, not starting its industrial process until the 80s, it happened there much more quickly than it did, say, in Europe. So I don't mean to suggest that India is facing a dark future, not what I'm saying. But their demographic moment is now, not in the past. They have basically the pyramid starts with older people, comes down to people in their 50s and then their 40s. And when you hit the 30s in India, it then goes almost straight down. The birth rate halved back in the 90s, and it has not bounced back. Now, that means at this moment in time, India does kind of have the magic mix. Because if you've got a lot of young adults who are 20 to 40, but not a huge number of kids, the money that they would have spent on their kids, they spend on themselves. And you get a lot higher quality of growth because when you're building homes and buying cars, that's going to just generate more follow-on growth than when you're buying diapers and taking care of childcare. So there's this 20-year period that the Indians have in front of them where they're going to have much more robust growth. But if their birth rate continues to drop, then 30 years from now, they're going to be looking at a situation like the Germans are facing today. Now, there's a lot that can go wrong and right in 30 years, but it is something to keep in mind. The youngest country in India's cohort is Mexico. They started the process a little bit later. The birth rate didn't drop quite as much, and the fact that they're partnered with the United States really helps. But when you want to talk about shining India, the idea of India as a major global power, you got to remember this. India has no partners at all. So Mexico can partner with the United States. Indonesia can partner with Vietnam and Singapore and Taiwan and Japan. India is on its own. Just the cultural norms of the country make it very difficult for it to see anyone else as an ally or even as a friend. And so any sort of manufacturing boom in India, which will happen, will have to be based entirely on Indian factors. And that's going to challenge the cost and the quality and everything else that goes along with that. So do I think India's got a great half century ahead of it? Yes, but by itself, not as part of a network that can help it. I think the biggest surprise that's going to be happening to most this decade is the collapse of China as a functional nation state. Their demographics are beyond terminal, and that was before they admitted that they miscounted by 100 million, and all the 100 million would have been people under age 40. So there's no point that they can support their existing population. There's no way that they can repopulate anymore. Their financial system is expanded by a factor of 34 since the year 2000, but their economy is barely quadrupled. So that's the biggest debt build we have seen in any country in human history. And now their payback for the new debt is minimal. So we've seen growth basically collapse from the 9 and 10% to like the 1 to 3%. And that's assuming you buy Chinese statistics, which I do not. They are completely dependent on the import of raw materials to support their agricultural and their energy system. And with the Ukraine war, they are now getting crude that is going west out of Russia to the Baltic, goes around Europe, goes through Suez, goes by India, goes by Vietnam, goes by Taiwan on the way in. So it's the most insecure energy supply line ever. And they're completely dependent upon the US Navy to protect their global shipping. And their war plan for Taiwan, I love this. Their war plan for Taiwan is so dumb. Like, we're going to sink all American ships within range and take the island, but the US Navy everywhere else in the world is going to continue to protect our corporate shipping. That is literally their plan. That is like the second dumbest thing I've heard in the last 20 years. The dumbest thing also involves China. We can talk about the spy balloon if you want to later. And then you throw in the cult of personality, which means that the Chinese are now so ossified that information is not even flowing within their own government, and they can't make competent decisions anymore. You add it all up, and China has had a great moment. But most of what has allowed China to become the China we know today is globalization. And the Americans aren't maintaining that anymore. And the other part of it is urbanization, which gives you growth, but you can only move people from the countryside to the city once. And if you can't keep that birth rate up, then they collapse. And that's exactly what we're facing this day. I don't think anyone thinks it's imminent. The Chinese don't think they have sufficient command and control in order to manage an operation today. They're thinking that maybe they can do it in a few years. And you're right, the community is split at all levels. I tend to veer towards that it's never going to happen. Let me kind of lay that out. When you decide you're going to invade a country, there's certain things that you prepare for because you don't just like pull the trigger. So the Chinese have always found the Russians to be useful idiots. So if they're going to do something that's a little sketchy, they try to get the Russians to do it first to see how it goes. And so when they look at Ukraine, they're like, you have to walk from Moscow to Kiev, and the Ukrainians have only been preparing for 8 years, and this war suddenly has gotten a lot more complicated than we thought. We've always known that Taiwan was going to be more difficult because it's going to be a naval assault. So assumption one, gone. Assumption two, Russian weapons are awesome. So they stole all the IP from the Russians and spent $3 trillion outfitting their troops. And now they're having some very serious buyer's remorse. The third assumption is that Russia and China are far too important to the global system, so no one will sanction them. Well, that's gone. But I think what's most terrified them is companies just walking away. I mean, there was something like $60 billion in foreign direct investment into the Russian system that was just abandoned because countries didn't want to be associated with a dictatorial, genocidal government at war. And so most of what they've planned for in terms of the environment has shifted. If you add in the fact that if there was a war, it would be very easy for the United States or Japan or Vietnam or India or Australia to simply cut the trade artery, which would lead to a deindustrialization and a famine in under a year. The cost of doing this to them would be extreme. So from my point of view, it's almost not worth considering. The one bit of pause that I've got is because this is a cult of personality system. And when one person sets the tone for the propaganda and then just lets it run, crazy stuff happens. And in this case, the Chinese believe, because of their propaganda, that they're so important that no one will really lift a finger. There might be some minor sanctions for a few years, and that's it. On the battlefield, they believe that they could probably capture the island in 2 weeks because it takes 6 weeks for the U.S. to sail from San Diego to get there in the first place. So as long as they do it quick, they're fine. Let's assume that that's right. That doesn't help their problem with oil tankers transiting by India and Vietnam and the rest. So their belief is that the world won't do anything.